welcome back. My name is Sheldon McLeod. This is Thinking Out Loud. And this is my spot on SaltWire.com to talk to people that I find interesting, with interesting stories, people who have something to give back to community, people who have, in some ways, aligned themselves with a lot of the things that I agree with. Sometimes I disagree with, but the idea being, it's a safe space to talk about things, to think out loud, which is partly the reason for the title. And I'll again invite you to find out or search out our new YouTube channel, where you can follow along and see some of the great work that my colleagues are doing at SaltWire. And speaking of SaltWire, and speaking of a bit of a blast from the past, there was a story a few years ago. It was about a launch of a book that was designed to realign the mental health system. And the person behind that book is someone that I had the distinct pleasure of spending quite a bit of time with over the years, and learning about what it is that he uses to view the world and to help others. And there was a point in time where some of what his behavior was and how it was presenting didn't quite fit with the person I knew. And there turns out to be a very, very good reason for that. It was something that I'd never really heard about, which was a side effect from a medication that manifests itself in a really different way. He is a consultant. He is someone who has taken the time to help educate. And Todd Leader, it's so good to see you again.
Good to see you, Sheldon.
And when I talked about that moment, I think I said to you before, when you came in with a T-shirt that said, "Some people call me condescending," and underneath it says, "That means I talk down to them." That to me signaled a bit of a change in tone with the Todd Leader that I knew. So what was going on in your life at the time?
Well, I have a serious case of restless leg syndrome, which people kind of take for granted as being just, the guy in the meeting whose leg is shaking. That's not what it is. It's a neurological disorder. And so I was on a medication for that called pramipexole. And pramipexole boosts dopamine in the brain. It's used for Parkinson's as well. But the way that it boosts dopamine, it causes, it's known in the literature to cause disinhibition, which means really you don't know where the line is between appropriate and inappropriate. And so if you think about, what starts to happen with your language and your behavior after you've had 2 or 3 drinks, it's a similar kind of thing. We sort of, that screen, and that awareness of appropriateness goes away. It causes impulse control disorders, which means really whatever crosses your mind, you let it out, you say it or do it. And it causes compulsive behavior, obsessive compulsive tendencies. And so, but it in many cases doesn't cause those effects until as much as 1 to 2 years after starting to take it. So you would never connect it logically, and intuitively to that medication. So I was on that, and my life started to change in some pretty significant ways during that time. And I became inappropriate with people, mostly with women. The 2 areas of life that this disinhibition and impulse control problem affects primarily are sex and money. And so, my language, my humor, my type of communication just started to become crass and inappropriate and disrespectful, sexually speaking. I gave away $12,000 to a former student over a period of a year. Many people develop gambling addictions because of that impulse control problem. So that's kind of where my life went, but I had no way to know that this was happening to me. That's the thing about disinhibition. If you don't see where the line is, then how do you know that you're crossing it?
But Todd, I'm going to suggest there were others in your life who saw this. I saw it in a way, but we weren't close enough for me to really be able to gauge or know what was going on in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, exactly. There were people in my personal life, there were people in my professional life who started to see that, there were things just not right. This was not the Todd they knew. And, but they couldn't, nobody had any idea what it was. Like, how do you name it? How do you put your finger on it to even say, this is what's happening. We need to get this checked. That's the problem. So My wife actually, we've been married now 34 years. We've had a fantastic marriage, and we're in it for life, quite literally. But during that time, she describes me as having been a different person. She doesn't say that I acted differently or I acted strange. It was so dramatic that for her, it was a personality change. It was that significant. And my daughter says the same thing. And so, people noticed, and it led to some more formal noticing of it as well, which we can get into in a minute, perhaps.
And kind of that reckoning. So what happens within yourself when people start telling you you're not yourself?
Well, when people start telling you that you're, kind of start calling you out on inappropriateness, and this was about 5 years ago. It was kind of at the peak of the Me Too movement, and here I was communicating in ways that were really just not respectful and appropriate with women in particular. And when people start to kind of call you out on that, to say it's inappropriate, and you're looking for the line, that line between appropriate and inappropriate, and as far as you can see, you're not crossing it, you start to wonder what's happening. Why are people attacking you? Like, there was that sort of a feeling like, what are you talking about? Because I couldn't see that line. And so I wasn't crossing it, in my mind. But it certainly started to create, because of being at least socially aware, and having lived my life trying to be on the appropriate side of that line and be a respectful person. The fact that people started to point out these things was really very disturbing for me, because I had no answer for it, and it was more than one person. I mean, I had somebody. I spoke at a conference in Ontario, and the written comments after my keynote address, two of them used words like vulgar and misogynistic. Now, that's not me. That's anybody who knows me knows that's not me. And I don't even know what I said. And that's the thing. So there were things like that started to happen, which were really psychologically incredibly disturbing for me.
So here we have the situation where a professional in the mental health field is having these kinds of reactions from people unaware. And one of the other topics that you and I discussed quite frequently was substance use and abuse. And I'm sure there were people who thought perhaps something else was happening, something deeper than, I'm not asking you to comment on what others said, but I'm going to call you out and ask, were there other things happening in your life outside of the side effects from this medication?
No, there weren't. There was, as it turned out, I ended up, there was another medication I was on. I've had depression my whole life. I've lived with that literally since I was in my teens. So that's just been a managed condition, like my arthritis, it's been nothing. But there was an antidepressant I was on that also boosts dopamine. And it was determined afterwards that it was actually making those side effects worse than they would normally have been for the pramipexole. But other than that, no. I mean, as things started to crumble for me, as the world started to close in on me like I was some kind of predator or monster of some sort, when that started to kind of happen, I do remember that I started to drink in the nights to try to help me get to sleep, and I've just never been interested in that, period. It's never been part of my life, but I did a little bit more for a period of a few months, probably only, just as things were crumbling. But no, there wasn't anything else happening. That's the thing. It was just this chemical effect.
What was it that finally brought you to that realization? Who was it that helped you connect the dots?
Well, there was this constant attempt by my wife to kind of say, something's wrong here. Like, what are you doing? But there was no explanation. I started to get formal complaints against me. So there was a formal complaint by a student to St. Mary's University, where I've been teaching for 32 years now. I had been teaching for 27 years at that point there, with a stellar reputation and ratings by students, and very respected. And I had a complaint with the regulatory bodies for psychologists and social workers, both, So there was probably a total of 5 formal complaints. I think, no, 6, sorry, 6 formal complaints through various organizations about me being inappropriate, as professionally speaking, and that started to. I mean, that made it. I'm going to say, I don't know if it increased any awareness of anything really, but it made it a much more serious issue for me because, again, I had no solution. I had no answer for it. And so what it culminated in actually was I reached a point where I kind of concluded that something had happened that changed me, according to everybody else. I couldn't go on living as that kind of person, because that's not who I was raised to be. That's not who I've spent my life being, trying to do good in the world, generally. But so that led me to a suicide attempt, because I wasn't going to go on living as that kind of person. And everybody was telling me I had become that kind of person. And like, sorry, I'm out. And so it was the suicide attempt, and then a second near attempt the next week that led to an urgent medication review by a psychiatrist, an outpatient psychiatrist. And an hour and a half into the discussion, he says, which is probably the most relieving line I've ever heard in my life. He said, "Well, I know what your problem is. It's this pramipexole. It causes the exact things that you've just described." And he said, "I think this other one is boosting it, and so we're going to take you off of those."
What has life been like since then?
It's been, well, the first, I'm going to say but about, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks after that point, I was coming off of this, and I could notice, everybody could notice the change in me. I was in Calgary at a hotel, speaking at a conference, and that night I was sitting there, and then the night was my most compulsive behavior. And I was sitting there in the hotel room, and I realized I didn't feel the need to text or message anybody. And that was a key compulsion of mine. But anyway, so that there was that phase of kind of getting off of that. And then the next, I'm going to say 1.5 to 2 years, I had none of those side effects. They were gone. I was in control, but I was experiencing such really serious depression over what had happened because of the shame of it, because of the nature of the behavior. It was deeply shameful for someone like me, I'm going to say, because I couldn't handle that. And so it made my depression and my feelings of shame worse than I've ever experienced. And it took a couple of years to kind of gradually get past that. So I really wasn't very effective in the work I was doing. I wasn't at my best in my life generally, but I worked through that with my wife and a psychologist, and learned to deal with some of it. And in the last couple of years, it's mostly been dealing with some post-traumatic kinds of symptoms. Actually, I don't have PTSD, but I do have some post-traumatic kinds of symptoms that have come from that still make some things difficult and triggering, kind of.
How has this affected or changed the way you view other people who may have behavior that manifests itself in a similar way?
I'm glad you asked that. That's, this is what I've learned a lot about in this thing. I mean, I've learned a lot about a lot of things, all that stuff I just talked about. These were kind of the unwanted but valuable lessons in life, right? But I've learned a lot about stigma from the inside instead of from the outside. It's no longer a theoretical concept. It's not an academic point. And so I've been analyzing. I'm one of the lucky people, I guess, in some ways, because I had the benefit of coming through this, first of all, coming out of it, and having the academic and professional kind of background to allow me to analyze it and try to come up with something practical for the world, in terms of lessons. So I started a book a few years ago about this. Didn't get very far emotionally, so I had to stop for a while, but I'm back at that. And what I've learned is that the whole idea of stigma is really about seeing someone's behavior and making judgments about what caused it. And so if we judge that the cause of the behavior is something about the person's character, their very personality or character. In social psych, we call that an internal attribution about a person's behavior. And if we deem it to be something else that caused it, then it's an external attribution. And I think that stigma really is us making internal attributions about the symptoms of people's addiction or mental illness problems. So there were people and organizations, and still are, who, regardless of 3 psychiatrists concluding that the medication caused this, independently concluding that, regardless of that, there were still people and organizations who could not get past the need to believe that my behaviors were because of my moral character. And so they needed their pound of flesh. So I experienced a suspension from St. Mary's University, for instance, despite the fact that they had information from my psychologist at the time that said, there's something happening here. There's something wrong. It's not diagnosed yet, but it's affecting Todd's judgment. And so despite knowing that there was a mental illness issue, they still proceeded to take a disciplinary approach, which means they've concluded that the person needs to be held accountable, not the illness. We need to blame and shame, right? And that's what people know stigma as. It's shaming somebody for having the symptoms of an illness. And so I had that kind of experience, but I've also had, very briefly, the College of Social Workers, for instance. They had an independent psychiatrist. They hired a psychiatrist to do an independent assessment of the whole thing. And when they got the information that said, this was the medication, they dismissed this and said, okay, well, here's a letter on your file kind of that says you need to make sure that you take care of your mental health, and be careful about medications. Like that was it. And which is, it should have, because they have a job to protect them, but it wasn't, they realized they didn't need to protect the public from Todd Leader's moral character. They needed to protect the public from a medication-induced illness that Todd ended up experiencing.
So much what I'm hearing from you, we can apply that to so much of what's happening in society with different marginalized groups and other people in our society who end up, in conflict with not just perhaps disciplinary boards, but the ultimate disciplinary board, or the judicial system. And, I think there are lessons there beyond what you've just expressed to us.
Yeah, that's a great insight. The reason that people like Judge Pam Williams created things like the Mental Health Court in Nova Scotia and, in many other jurisdictions, the reason those have been created where they do exist is specifically for this reason, so that the court system doesn't blame the person, their moral character, kind of their personality, doesn't blame them for behaviors that actually are symptoms of an addiction or a mental illness, but instead gets them on the right path, in the right kind of service or support. And that doesn't mean there's no accountability, but it's a different approach because it's recognizing that it's not the person, it's the illness that is the cause. So now how do we address that in a more targeted way? So that's great insight. Yeah. And, we do this all the time we're doing this with, people who are without housing, the homeless. We blame them for whatever, for having to urinate outside or for being, in the wrong neighborhood. And we blame them as people when we know that there are situational factors in their lives that are causing the situation that they're in. And so how do you blame the person when we have a society that stigmatized them so much that they aren't able to get the right kind of treatment for their mental illness, or they're not able to get a job because they don't have the clothes, or it goes on and on, right? Mm-hmm.
So we're inside this snow globe. People are coming into the holidays, and their world around them is in chaos. What does Todd Leader suggest moving forward, since part of your career has been, much of your career has been helping people like yourself who finds themselves in this whirlwind, but it's only around them and affecting those closest to them?
Yeah. Well, I guess I get a couple things, a couple key points, I guess. One that I've learned from this is, and this is very specific to my case, kind of, but generalizable, and that is, anytime any of you are taking a new prescription, it doesn't matter what it's for, because mine was not a psychiatric medication. It was for restless leg syndrome, so, but anytime you're taking a new one, don't just read quickly, if you even read the document the pharmacist gives you, don't just read quickly past anything that relates to psychological effects. Like you might see something that says may cause changes in mood, and so you're blah, 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 blah. Yeah. I'm just looking for pains and rashes and things. You know what I mean? Well, don't do that. If it mentions anything related to emotions, mood, psychological effects, mental health, depression, anything like that, here's my key suggestion. Don't you watch for those symptoms. Get other people in your life aware of those symptoms, and so that they are now on alert to watch for them, because they're the only ones who will notice them. They will notice them before you do. In many cases, if I had done that, if I had known, I didn't know that it had these effects, but if I had known, if I had read or asked or been told and had this insight, I would have told my family and other people, just watch for this happening in about a year and a half. In that case, it's a weird one, but so that's one thing. The other thing is, the minute you start to feel any kind of distress, emotional, psychological distress, or if your family members or friends are telling you that they're seeing signs of something not quite right, and whether that's concerns over how much you're drinking or using, cannabis or something else, or whether it's other behavioral kinds of changes that they're seeing in you that are disturbing for them, take them seriously. Try your best to get outside of yourself and the defensiveness that sometimes comes and all of that. Try to get past that and recognize that often other people are actually more accurate observers of our behavior. And so trust them, listen to what they're saying, so that you can then try to get to talk to somebody about it.
Todd Leader, I thank you for opening yourself up to this conversation, for sharing what you went through to help perhaps others who may find themselves in a similar situation. And I truly do appreciate your candor, your honesty, and your ability to talk about this. It's not easy for some people perhaps to come to this place in their life where, thank goodness, it is much better now, but after what you'd gone through. So thank you for that.
It's my pleasure.
I understand. Understood.
Yeah.
All the best to you, sir.
Thank you, Sheldon.